Well, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time now, you know that one of the things that we like to do is to visit old historic cemeteries and spend a little bit of time walking amongst the dead and learning about the history so that we can extract lessons for the living. Well, right now, I am at a German war cemetery in Munich, Germany. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here today, and we're also going to be going to some other cemeteries around Munich where we are going to be visiting the graves of some individuals who were very instrumental in assisting Hitler in his rise to power. They include a filmmaker, a homosexual, and also a man of Jewish ancestry. So anyway, got a lot that we're going to be looking at today. As I mentioned, this war cemetery that we are at right now is in Munich, Germany. And as you walk into the cemetery, you can see this memorial hall that they have at the entrance. And I can't go inside, but you can kind of see a little bit of how they have it, for lack of a better term, decorated. There's really not much in there. But as we walk into the cemetery itself, this is actually quite pretty. Kind of walk across this pond here as we're going in. But this war cemetery has, I don't know the exact number, it's around 3,000 graves. Now, not all of them are World War II. Approximately half are World War I, and the other half are from the Second World War. And I've said this before, it's really interesting to me to visit these German war cemeteries because they are all just so different, and this one is no exception. So I've seen German war graves in Normandy, I've seen German war graves in Poland, and now seeing one in Germany, and like I said, they're all quite unique. Anyway, we're going to take a look at a few of the graves here. Now, in the cemetery, I can't say that I know of anyone that is, for lack of a better term, noteworthy. It would be a recognizable name, I guess I should say. Everyone is noteworthy to someone, I would hope, but you know what I mean. But I do want to take a look at a few of these here. This is right here at the very beginning of the cemetery, or at the front end. I noticed there are all of these graves for unknown soldiers, and they all have the exact same date on them of April 21st of 1945. So we don't know exactly what happened to these soldiers, and of course we don't know who they are. What I do know is that in April of 45, Munich was getting hammered from Allied air power. So it's possible that maybe these soldiers were killed in an air raid. I'm just walking around here and happened to see another set of graves, all with the same death date. Here's a Wilhelm Schmidt, February 22nd, 1945. And again, you see the same death date here. Same death date here for George Mueller. And then also Rosa Soldner. Okay, so we have a woman in here too. So I'm guessing that these are people who were living in Munich, and they're all buried right here together. Oh, and then here's a grave for an unknown woman. Huh. I mentioned that there are both World War I and World War II soldiers who are buried in this cemetery, and this appears to be at least a section of World War I individuals who were killed in the Great War. So yeah, you can just kind of walk along here. Oh man, look at this one. Fritz Steinhilber, who died November 4th of 1918. So, almost made it to the end and was killed. It would be devastating to any family to, lose a son or a brother or a husband, but to lose one right at the end of the war when they were, just within days of the armistice, had to be extra painful. Well, this is interesting. We have a Soviet soldier who is buried here. Died, looks like June 10th of 44. My Russian is rough. Vladimir Primak, I think is what that is. So I wonder if he was maybe a Soviet prisoner of war who was here in the Munich area and died. Oh, here's another one. Who died April 25th of 45. And that says Neizvestny Soldat. Oh, unknown soldier. Huh. Interesting. Okay, well, I was surprised to find a Soviet grave, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. There are actually a lot here. All of these markers right through here are all etched with Cyrillic. So yeah, I guess these are all Soviet prisoners. I had a friend who passed away a few years ago, who was a prisoner of war of the Germans, and he said that, man, the Russian prisoners were treated exceptionally bad by the Germans. So I guess it should be no surprise that there would be a lot of Soviets in this cemetery. Well, I guess I am surprised that they're in the cemetery and not like in some, unmarked mass grave somewhere. Huh. Always finding new things. Got a few more graves here. This one, Max Strasser, died November 19th of 1941. Here's a George Maurer, October 30th of 1941. So we're kind of getting into Operation Barbarossa here. So my guess is that a lot of these are deaths from the Eastern Front. But very interesting to walk among these grave markers here. There's always a certain element of sadness walking around these war cemeteries, especially when you stop and look at the birth dates and the death dates and calculate how old some of these men were. You know, a lot of them, of course, are quite young, 18, 19, 20 years old. And then there's others, like this one here, Ernst Röhm. I looked, and when he died, he was the same age that I am right now. So maybe he had a wife and kids like I do who mourned his passing. And some people may say, well, why would you be sad, you know, for the enemy combatants who died? Well, you have to realize not everybody was the same. Maybe there were some people who were, you know, full in on the idea of Nazism and everything like that, and of course we would rightfully condemn that. Maybe some of these were people who just got caught up in this madness and were doing the best that they could at the time and suffered the ultimate consequence. I was reading yesterday about 3 guys who were in a resistance movement against Hitler called the White Rose here in Munich. Well, they ended up getting drafted and were sent to the Eastern Front. So they served in the military. Well, any one of them could have very well been killed in combat while, you know, actively opposing Hitler. So anyway, all of these things are complicated. But one thing that we can say is that the graves of some of the people that we're going to be looking at today are people who are largely responsible for what we see right here. One of the things that Hitler and the Nazis really relied on in their rise to power was propaganda. And this woman right here was very instrumental in the visual part of that propaganda. This is the grave of filmmaker Lenny Riefenstahl. So early in Hitler's career, she heard him speak and was kind of mesmerized. And likewise, Hitler had seen some of her work. She had directed a film called Blue Light in 1932 that he really liked the aesthetics of. So he asked her to direct a documentary film in 1933 called The Victory of Faith, kind of a lesser known one, but it was a short film shot at the Nuremberg Nazi Party rally that year. And that ended up being a template for probably her best known work, which was a film called The Triumph of the Will. Or not The Triumph of the Will, just Triumph of the Will. It was filmed the following year in 1934 at the Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. And really, at the time, was regarded as an epic piece of filmmaking and was really well directed. She also directed a film called Olympia for the 1936 Olympic Games, but was probably the most renowned documentary filmmaker of the Third Reich era. Now, during World War II, as you know, the violence was escalating, Lenny Riefenstahl, I think, started having some second thoughts about her association with Hitler and the Third Reich. She was in Poland to do some film work, and was accompanying some German troops in the town of Konski, I think was the name of it. And anyway, long story short, while she was there, she saw some Polish civilians who were executed for partisan activities. And there's a photo of her where you can see her reaction, and she is visibly distressed. And apparently left the filming for that day and was trying to make an appeal to Hitler to put an end to, you know, such violence. But she still filmed his parade into Warsaw just a few weeks later. After the war, Riefenstahl tried to kind of distance herself from, you know, Hitler and the Nazis and the whole Third Reich movement. But she was forever connected with the propaganda of the Third Reich through her film Triumph of the Will. And this is her grave. Okay, I'm just walking away from the grave of Lenny Riefenstahl, which took me forever to find. I've been looking for that thing for like an hour and a half now. This cemetery that I'm at is just massive. I think I would say it's bigger than Arlington, just from what I can see. But anyway, as I was walking out, I noticed like a section of the cemetery where it's just a bunch of flat stones, and didn't even know this was here, but apparently there's an Italian cemetery, Italian military cemetery that's here as well. Yeah, so looky here. Interesting. Let's showcase how terrible my Italian is. Cimitero Militare Italiano. And then down there it says Italienischer Military Friedhof. Okay, so that's military cemetery. But anyway, again, I had no idea that this was here. Kind of interesting that there are Italian military graves here in Munich. I mean, we're always learning new things, and traveling to places like this is what helps us to come up against the things that we don't know. I was not aware that there were any Italian troops here in Germany. So we may have to do a little bit more investigating on that and see what was up. But several, right here in this section, looks like who died towards the end of the war. I'm seeing a lot of Mays. I'm seeing, I saw a few Aprils. Yeah, a lot of these, yeah, here's May 25th, 1945. So that's after the war is over. So maybe died of wounds. Here's another one, May 29th. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next place. Alright, so we're going to be jumping around to cemeteries today, and right now I've moved to a cemetery called the Nordfriedhof here in Munich, and there are several graves that I'm hoping to find here in this cemetery. Before we get going, I know it's ridiculous that I have to do this, but I do need to mention that, of course, we're not celebrating any of these individuals or celebrating the ideology or anything like that. I know that people get all crossways whenever I put these disclaimers in the video, but we live in a ridiculous world. So anyway, we're just examining the history is all that we're doing. All right, got a lot of walking I think we're going to be doing here today. Whew, all right, well, we've had to do a little bit of walking here to find this first grave in the Nordfriedhof, but finally managed to track it down. This is the grave of an individual that you may have never heard of before, named Emil Maurice. And even if you've never heard of him, well, he was somebody who figured quite prominently in Hitler's life early on, or at least, you know, in his early rise to power. Maurice was one of the early members of the German Workers' Party, and he and Hitler were quite close. As a matter of fact, he addressed Hitler on very informal terms, which few people were allowed to do. He participated in the beer hall putsch. As a matter of fact, there are some pictures that you can find online of him wearing his Blood Order medal. But he was also one of the early leaders of the SA, so the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, and was, I guess, you could almost say the founder of the SS. Hitler was SS member number 1, and Maurice was number 2. Now, Maurice would go on to become Hitler's chauffeur, and there's a few interesting things about this guy. One, he had, shall we say, an intimate relationship with Hitler's half-niece named Geli Rabaul. Geli was someone that Hitler was quite infatuated with. They lived in the same apartment, and when Hitler found out about the relationship that Emil and Geli were having, he demanded that it come to an immediate end. There are thoughts that Hitler had like a romantic attraction to Geli, and then she ended up committing suicide. So the fact that Emil lived through that is pretty remarkable. What's even more remarkable of something that he lived through is that later on, Himmler, who was a conniving weasel and was always trying to, find dirt on somebody to elevate himself, found out that Emil Maurice was of Jewish ancestry. I think it was his great-grandparents were Jewish. Well, in the Third Reich, that's a no-go. When Hitler found out, he wrote a letter to Himmler asking that, or saying that Emil Maurice be made an honorary Aryan. So here you have somebody who was very high up in the Nazi leadership, at least early on, is discovered to have Jewish ancestry, and Hitler gives him a pass. I don't know if I have anything insightful to say about that, other than to say that it's interesting. But yeah, there's the grave of Emil Maurice. All right, we've moved over to another section of the cemetery, and in a previous episode of History Traveler, we were talking about the Beer Hall Putsch, which was, of course, Hitler's attempt to overthrow the government. And we talked about how when the Nazis came up against the police, there was an exchange of gunfire, and several members of Hitler's entourage were killed in that gunfire exchange. Well, one of them was this guy right here, Andreas, and I'm going to say Waldfriedhof is how you say his last name. I could be wrong on that, but Andreas Waldfriedhof is what we're going to go with. You can see the date of his death there as November the 9th of 1923, of course the date of the Beer Hall Putsch. Now here is why I'm coming to this particular grave. In later years, there was this sacred artifact of the Nazis called the blood flag that had the blood stains of one of the members of the Beer Hall Putsch who had died that day. Well, the man's blood who was on the blood flag was Andreas Waldfriedhof. If you watched the series that we did in Normandy, well, you may remember a few episodes where we talked about how the Canadians had some run-ins with the 12th SS Panzer Division, also known as the Hitler Jugend Division or the Hitler Youth Division. This was a group of really, really young guys who had come up in the Hitler Youth and were absolutely fanatical and really did some terrible things during the Battle of Normandy. Well, this is the grave of Max Wünsche. I think that's how you say his name. But he was the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Now, earlier in the war, he had served with Kurt Meyer, who also ended up becoming the commander of the 12th SS. And on the Eastern Front, in February of 43, I think, in the Battle of Kharkiv, he had performed some actions that led to him being awarded the German Cross and Gold. And then a few days later, did some more stuff, I won't get into it all here, that led to him being awarded the Knight's Cross. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, later was given the regimental command of the 12th SS Regiment of the 12th SS Panzer Division. And yeah, his grave is right here. Here's one that we will just make quick mention of. This is the grave of an individual named Paul Ludwig Troost. And you've likely never heard of him. He died in 1934, but this was Hitler's favorite architect. And as a matter of fact, there's a picture that's floating around out there, and I don't know if I'll be able to find it or not, but it shows Hitler standing right here, paying his respects to the grave of Troost. And he would have a wreath laid on this grave every year. Now, something that's kind of interesting, if we move up here, well, you'll notice that there's some discoloration, right around here on this headstone. Well, at one time, they had a Nazi eagle up there. Well, of course, after the war, everything was being denazified, including this headstone. So you can still kind of see the shadow of where it was at one time. So the head would have been here, the swastika down here, and the wings sticking out there. But, yeah. There's the grave of Hitler's favorite architect. Most of the pictures that you have seen of Adolf Hitler, from his rise to power all the way through the war, were likely taken by a man named Heinrich Hoffmann, who was his official photographer. Hoffmann was a photographer for the German army in World War I, actually captured a very early image of Adolf Hitler in a crowd there at the Feldenhall in Munich, and then ended up, just following him around and taking a lot of his official photos. Well, he is also buried here in the cemetery, but I'll be dadgum, I cannot find his grave. And I have walked, I don't know how far. Some of these graves, it's really hard to find information on as far as their location. So anyway, he just know that he's buried here somewhere. Also, Hitler's secretary that was with him in the Führer bunker right there at the end of the war when he committed suicide, she's depicted in the movie Downfall. She's also buried here. I can't find her grave. So I think I'm just going to have to take the loss on these two and move on to the next place. We are now in the Waldfriedhof cemetery, and here along the fringes we have the grave of a rather thuggish individual who was very instrumental in Hitler's rise to power, and that is Ernst Röhm. Now, Ernst Röhm was a veteran of the First World War. He had been wounded in that war, which left his face really scarred. And after the war, he had this reputation around Munich as being like this hard-drinking, tough street fighter type. And he led this political gang that went up against the local communists. I mean, this was a rough figure. If you look at him, he even kind of looks like a bull. Just a very stocky individual, very aggressive. But anyway, he became a friend of Hitler during Hitler's early rises to power, was one of the early leaders of the SA, or the brown shirts. This was kind of Hitler's private army, or private security force. And Röhm was a very close confidant of Hitler. He was one of the few who didn't say Mein Führer. He addressed Hitler on more familiar terms, and even called him by his nickname. But anyway, Röhm was part of the beer hall putsch. He and some of the others had taken over the war ministry in Munich, and as a matter of fact, that's where Hitler and those that were marching with him were headed to on the day of the beer hall putsch. But anyway, that failed. Röhm got arrested, and like many of the others, got off pretty light. But when Hitler got out of prison and started his rise to power, well, Ernst Röhm became very instrumental in that. Now, one of the things that is really interesting about him, and that was really kind of problematic for the public image of the Nazis, is that Ernst Röhm was a homosexual. This was constantly being talked about in the press, and there were a lot of rumors around Munich about his activities. But what is really, I guess, kind of fascinating to me is that Hitler didn't seem to mind. It wasn't like it was a big secret or anything. He didn't seem to care. As a matter of fact, he was quoted as saying that, what he did in his private life was, none of his business. But anyway, Ernst Röhm would not live to see Hitler's full rise to power. As you can see here, the date of his death is July of 1934. So Ernst Röhm was kind of seen as a bit of a threat to Hitler. Himmler and Goering especially did not like him and didn't want to have to compete with him. So they convinced Hitler that he needed to go. So on the front end of what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, well, Röhm was going to be one of the victims of this effort to basically take out or murder or eliminate these political rivals or any political adversaries. The ones who were placed in charge of, I guess you could say, taking care of Ernst Röhm was Theodor Eicke. He was going to later become the Commandant of Dachau, and another SS guy by the name of Michael Leipert. So they, had Röhm arrested, and he was in his cell. They show up with a Browning pistol that had one bullet in it and handed it to him and said that he had 10 minutes to kill himself or they would take care of it. So anyway, 10 minutes passed by, they came back, and Ernst Röhm said that if Adolf Hitler wanted him dead, well, then he could take care of it himself. So they ended up shooting Röhm, and he is buried right here. Now, you might be watching this and asking yourself, why even bring up the fact that Ernst Röhm was a homosexual? Why does that even matter? Well, I find the whole thing interesting. The fact that, Röhm is a homosexual and Hitler has no issue with it, but then, not too long after his death, well, people like Röhm are going to be sent to concentration camps and put in striped uniforms with a pink triangle on them. The whole thing is just rather interesting to me, in the same way that it's interesting to me that, of course, the whole Nazi ideology is grounded on the fact that the Jews are the enemies of the world, and yet when it's discovered that a friend of his, who he had close ties with, had Jewish ancestry, makes him an honorary Aryan, whatever the heck that is. So here you have this evil man who can't even live up to the standards of his own hateful ideology. Again, the whole thing is just interesting to me. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and move on. Didn't find all the graves that we had hoped to today. Anton Drexler is also buried here, the guy who recruited Hitler and basically discovered him and started this whole mess. But I can't find his grave either. But anyway, we're going to be moving out of Munich now and on to some places that I've wanted to visit for a long time.